We're looking at Leslie Marmon Silko's Tony story. Now, this is a short story coming to us by a Native American writer of Laguna Pueblo descent. And so this qualifies as a Native American text as well for us. Now, what we find in this piece is not only the fact that she's, of course, set it within her community, within her people, but she's also showing us the interaction between modernity, all right, or modern concerns versus the traditional belief systems that exist within the Native American community. So, what we're also seeing is that there is a desire to address a changing reality, all right, because with the entry of the white man into America and the resulting um, violence, um, the interactions between them have been not always pleasant. All right, maybe in the beginning there were to some extent um, a far more willing equation between the two communities, but over time it has become one of violence, of a great deal of distrust, right? And both groups have been impacted by this equation, maybe not to the same extent. So, here, for instance, we are looking at two people, two characters. All right, they are the main figures that we're looking at. One is Tony, whose story it is, and we have Leon, his friend, who is also from the same community, but he has stepped out. He has joined the army. He has had very different experiences. He has interacted more with white culture and has probably come back with a sense of, uh, we're probably a little backward, or we don't understand a lot of things, or we're too accepting of this kind of treatment, and this is a problem, and we should be fighting for our rights. All right. And Silko is not necessarily telling us which of these characters is correct or wrong. So the beauty of Silko's Tony story is that she's not taking a stance per se. She is giving us definitely a subjective narrative. There's no doubt about it. The short story is called Tony's story. So it is Tony's version of everything. So it is about perception more than reality. And that is one of the central things that comes through in this particular story. That it is less about what actually went and more about what the character has understood and is then relating to us. All right. But what we see that through this interaction of the insider, that's Tony, and the outsider, that's Leon, we are also looking at a changing reality of the Native American community. And Silko's story shows us a desire to sort of reclaim heritage through writing, all right, and to also in many ways place into context the relevance of tribal artistic expressions, tribal artistic beliefs, tribal spiritual belief systems, all right, their mythology, their rituals, their oral tradition, because it's very easy to look at it as Leon does from the white man's perspective and be like, oh, this does make sense, and how could you hold on to this viewpoint? But it's also important to sort of see it in context as to how and why it sort of developed. All right, so that is really one of the key things about the text. Now, the text is about racism. Okay, very obviously it's about racism, about racial violence against the Native American community, something that's not very consciously addressed in a lot of fiction. Majority of fiction that comes from the American context usually explores the African American racist experience. The Native American experience is truly erased in that sense, which is why I say a film like Killers of the Flower Moon becomes really fascinating, because it not just explores the concerns, it actually breaks it down for us as to the level of violence that is central to this narrative, because it's a narrative of erasure, it's a narrative of uh, stealing, someone's space, someone's identity, someone's access to resource. It's all a lot of those things. It's a really complex narrative, but of course we're going to look at Silko's Tony story, and we're going to explore what she sort of tries to convey through this particular text. Now, the story is split into 4 parts, all right, and it is a story about a crime, okay, but it's not as straightforward as we would like it to be. Incidentally, it's also supposed to be inspired by a true incident. That's again not the focus of what the story is really about. The story is about uh, being raised within a certain belief system, and thus understanding violence from within that perspective, versus someone who has now stepped out of that system, has been alienated from that system, and understands it differently. All right. But at the end of it, how do both parties sort of react to it? Okay, there is a lot of subtle clues that Silko gives us throughout the story. All right, like I said, she's not taking a stance, she is giving us a perspective. It's up to us to sort of understand what to make with that perspective. All right, and it may be easy to call Tony flawed, problematic, a criminal, and lots of other things. But it's a very contextual narrative, so it's very important for us to understand that. So let's break it down. Let's go to part 1 of the text. Now, one of the things that the text constantly presents for us is the weather. The weather is very central to the text. It may have also something to do with the fact that communities that live alongside nature, or that are so closely associated with nature, see signs and portents in nature, and use that to sort of understand and define their own realities. All right. So here, this is something that recurs constantly. All right. The reference to how hot it is, how terribly dry it has become, and that's a recurring image that we have. So let's look at the opening. It happened one summer when the sky was wide and hot, and the summer rains did not come. The sheep were thin, and the tumbleweeds turned brown and died. Now, automatically we're told that it's clearly an event set in the past, and it's set in a specific context. Okay, this is by the way the opening and the reference to the heat in the first part. There is also a reference later on when you have it in the same part after Leon has been beaten, and the dust soaked up the blood almost before it dripped to the ground. It had been a very dry summer, so slightly hyperbolic, but the idea sort of conveyed to us that it's an extremely hot, dry incident. Now, why is the weather such a central part of Tony's story? Because now there is a white cop who is clearly targeting Leon for the fact that he comes across as very arrogant, according to the white cop, because according to the white cop, Native Americans are supposed to behave submissive around him and not blatantly break rules. But you have Leon, who has come from the army, who has a very different exposure, who has been treated on par with white people, and so thus does not understand the point in acting submissive, and so thus the white cop has a huge problem with his behavior. Now, of course, maybe we should illustrate what do we mean by saying that Leon may have been treated on par with others. Not to say that the defense does not have discrimination. They do, but honestly, when you are fighting alongside a person for a great number of, you know, days, months, all of those things, you will learn to set aside those concerns because it's really boils down to survival, in which case you are like brothers in arms. And so you find that if you do your work, you're being treated in a certain way. Not to say that discrimination wouldn't have existed. There must have been pay disparity, there may have been a lot of other things that would have definitely been there, but his treatment would have still been very different from how it would have been with it within his community, with his people, where he may have interacted with white people and been treated very differently compared to, say, in the army, where he would have been treated more on par. That's so to place it in context as to what may have been the thing. Now, Leon looks at the white cop as a figure of violence, a figure of racist violence. Tony does not. Tony recognizes that he's violent. He's, of course, also a much more submissive figure. So he has never openly behaved in a fashion to draw the attention of a white cop. But he's also someone who registers the white cop as a supernatural figure. Now, it's easy to look at Tony's perspective and be like, dude, are you serious? How? But the fact is that for him, from his cultural perspective, figures of irrational violence are usually supernatural witch figures that ought to be destroyed. From his perspective, it does make sense. Even if it doesn't make logical sense to people or someone who's neutrally reading it and sort of being like, whoa, what? That perspective does make sense because that's where Leon is coming from. But for Tony, it's very clear. This person is behaving very irrationally. Thus, this person is reflective of a certain supernatural violence. Thus, this person is that being of supernatural violence. And so that's where the framework is really coming for us, which is why the focus on the weather becomes really important, because in part one we say that it happened on such a day. Then we're told about how the dust soaked up the blood, all right, because it was that dry a summer. Then in part two, we are not given any indication of the weather per se. We're given more about Leon and Tony's perspective of Leon. In part three, again, the opening is the sky was hot and empty. The half-grown tumbleweeds were dried up flat and brown beside the highway, and across the valley heat shimmered above wilted fields of corn. And then the last line of that same paragraph is, and then I knew why the drought had come that summer. So the thing is, in the part three itself, we realize that Tony has come to understand the disturbance in nature as a reflection of a figure of supernatural violence. We as neutral readers will be like, no, that doesn't make sense. Leon, as someone who stepped out of the Pueblo, would also be like, no, that's a natural phenomenon and this man is a racist cop. That's it. But for Tony, considering that his traditional identity matters so much to him, it's his central perspective. That is how he understands the world. All right. And so he cannot be criticized for it per se. You can't say that it's a perspective that he shouldn't be holding. Can he help it? He has only been exposed to that identity, to that reality. It makes sense that he understands things from that framework. So it may be logically flawed, but cannot actually be held against him. All right. Now, we are also shown right from the first part the various differences that exist between Tony and Leon, and that's really important. And the story subtly sort of marks it out for us. So, for instance, they're meeting after a while, and we have Leon yell out his name, and sort of we have Tony's response to that. I was embarrassed to hear him yell so loudly, but then I saw the wine bottle in the brown paper sack crushed around it. So again, culturally, it's not an accepted way of behaving. And then also the fact that he's noticed the alcohol in his hand, so he's like, oh, maybe that's why he's acting like this. So differently from usual. Then he grabbed my hand and held it tight like a white man. Again, something that he's not culturally familiar with. To also say, one, what is native cultural identity, and also to say how Leon has clearly stepped away from it. All right, and to again heighten how Leon is so dissonant from his Native American identity. It's good to be home again. They asked me to dance tomorrow. It's only the corn dance, but I hope I haven't forgotten what to do. So it's clearly a very symbolic cultural event. It's very central to their identity, but he's like, I've been away for so long. I have no guarantee if I remember. But Tony's reaction is very clear. Remember, it'll all come back to you when you hear the drum. And I was happy because I knew that Leon was once more a part of the Pueblo. So again, the idea that to have someone return to the fold is so comforting because you know that you're not losing connection to each other. And that's important because especially when you are a community that is being terrorized in many ways or on the receiving end of a lot of violence, the last thing you want is for the few people that you know to leave and to completely cut contact with the community, because cutting contact with the community is as good as cutting contact with your heritage, with your tradition, with your cultural identity. And then you are, well, more or less people who don't have something to sort of situate yourself in. Because it is your culture that helps you cope with things. So that is Tony's very valid fear in that sense. And so this very clear sense of like, okay, now that he's back, things are actually going to get better. Now, we're introduced to the cop as well. All right. It was then that I saw the cop pushing his way through the crowds. He came steadily towards us. I'm making out sentences. I remembered Leon's whine and looked to see the cop was watching us, but he was wearing dark glasses and I couldn't see his eyes. This is also an important thing because him not being able to see the cop's eyes, no matter how the light falls, no matter what happens, like the glasses don't shift, becomes another aspect of Tony's fear, his genuine fear of the cop. It borders on a point where you're like, it's irrational, but remember, we're talking about racial violence. Racial violence itself is irrational. For someone to behave violent towards somebody purely because they are of a different race, community, identity is in itself a very irrational idea. So is it so surprising that your fear of being on the receiving end of that would also then be irrational? All right. Now, he never said anything before he hit Leon in the face with his fist. So it's an unprovoked act of violence. All right. Sure, the rules say that you're not supposed to possess intoxicants on the reservation. Fair enough. But a warning could have been given. It could have been handled differently. But the white cop chooses to act with violence almost immediately, as opposed to responding to this in a far more balanced fashion. He may be a cop, but technically you can't do such things. But the fact that he chooses to act with violence immediately places him in a very he's immediately sort of becomes representational of this very irrational, dark violence that's meted out against minority communities. All right. And the thing is that we've already had this incident, which is why in part two, we understand Tony's fear. And of course, Tony has to sort of justify his real fears. And so his justification comes from his traditional background. So he's frightened because, one, it's an unprovoked act of violence. He came out of nowhere and somehow managed to see him carry a wine bottle and hits him for it. So it makes no sense. So he feels like, oh my God, is there something that can watch me and know what I'm doing? Right? So stillness breathed around me, and I wanted to run from the feeling behind me in the dark. The stories about witches ran with me. That night I had a dream. The big cop was pointing a long bone at me. They always use human bones, and the whiteness flashed silver in the moonlight where he stood. He didn't have a human face, only small, round, white-rimmed eyes on a black ceremonial mask. So he's been so frightened by that incident that he cannot think clearly. And fear does that to people. So it's a very, very natural reaction. All right? And he's so worked up by that entire incident, but his solution is, let's not think about it, let's not talk about it, let's not make a big deal about it. But Leon has lived outside. He has seen how white people deal with such things, go to the cops, or file with the higher authorities, make a bigger deal of it, and make sure that this is handled by law, right? And for Tony's like, why are you making a big deal of this? So he also says, I wondered why men who came back from the army were troublemakers on the reservation. Leon even took it up before the Pueblo meeting. They discussed it, and the old men decided that Leon shouldn't have been drinking. The interpreter read a passage out of the revised Pueblo Law and Order Code about possessing intoxicants on the reservation, so we got up and left. It's kind of like that's also a dead end because the law clearly says you can't have it. So technically, even though the cop acted with an extreme reaction, nothing's going to be held against him because it'll be like, oh, I just tried to control the situation. And he can always say like, oh no, he seemed like, somebody who would make a scene, so I had to deal with it as harshly as possible. And it then becomes the cop's word against them, and nobody's going to listen to them because they're already at a cultural, social, and racial disadvantage in this equation. And even the people at the Pueblo, the leaders of the community, are going to be unwilling to make a big deal of it. Right? Because even in the previous part, when the cop hits Leon, people crowd around. The tribal policemen knelt over Leon, and one of them looked up at the state cop and asked what was going on. The big cop didn't answer. It's like, I don't need to give you a response. I don't need to justify what I did. I am totally justified in whatever I do. So we already see a power play in this entire equation. And now the part 2 ends very interestingly because they stop at the store to pick up something, and he notices. So Tony steps out. Tony notices a cop there. He was inside. I stopped in the doorway and turned around before he saw me. He already knew we were there. Now, either it could be that the cop saw them and that's how he knew, but as far as Tony is concerned, this man didn't turn around. But he seemed to know how we were already here, which means he has some supernatural power that is giving him insight, and that makes him more and more frightening. So he says, let's go, the big cop's inside. Leon gunned it, and the pickup skidded back on the highway. He glanced back in the rearview mirror. I didn't see his car. He didn't, I said. Leon shook his head. He can't do it again. We're just as good as them. The guys who came back always talk like that. Now, obviously, Tony has not completely come to make that full conclusion that the white cop is evil personified, a supernatural evil personified. But he's getting there because everything, it's sort of becoming like a self-fulfilling prophecy for him. And so his fear is getting more and more heightened. And that's really where the text is stemming from. All right. So we will continue with the next two parts and sort of give us a conclusion, a good a tying up of the entire thing in the next discussion video of ours.